Here we go. I know you're crushed, but here's our last lecture for Unit 4. We're going to talk a little bit about some effects of aging and a few muscular disorders. So what happens as we get older? Your cardiac and skeletal muscle tissues, and again, you're going to learn more about cardiac muscle when you take Biology 202, but those tissues become amitotic. That prefix A means without mitosis. So it means the muscle fibers are not dividing and creating new muscle fibers. However, they can lengthen and they can thicken, like we were talking about on the last video lecture. So your myofibrils, those bundles of actin and myosin, thin and thick filaments, they can get thicker, they can get longer, and that gives you more power for contraction. But you're not really replacing muscle cells. Now you do have cells in your muscles that are called satellite cells. So they're smaller cells and they help you out with repairs. And they are actually separate cells. They're called myoblasts, like skeletal muscle cells. A myoblast would be, a myo refers to muscle, a blast is usually an immature, not completely mature or specialized type cell. So it's almost like they're functioning like immature skeletal muscle fibers, but really what they apparently do is if you have muscle fibers that get torn or injured, your muscle fiber cells actually get ripped open, due to overuse. A lot of times that's what you notice that by soreness in your muscles after you've been exercising. So apparently what these satellite cells do is they're in your muscles and they'll actually fuse with damaged muscle fibers, and that helps them make the repairs that they need to do. Now your injured heart muscle, on the other hand, this happens in skeletal muscle. Your heart muscle is mainly replaced by connective tissues, scar tissue. That's why when you have a heart attack is caused when the blood supply is cut off to some of your cardiac muscle in the wall of the heart. And if those muscle fibers die, they cannot be replaced with new muscle fibers. Instead, you replace that with fibrous connective tissue that, believe me, that's not helping your heartbeat. So that's why after a heart attack, you can lose significant heart function, and if it's bad enough, you're not going to be able to survive the heart attack. Now your smooth muscle, on the other hand, that's your involuntary muscle tissue you have in the walls of hollow organs, including your blood vessels and your lymphatic vessels, and other tube-like organs as well. It's able to regenerate throughout life, so it does do mitosis. It can be replaced. So that's in contrast to your skeletal and your cardiac muscle tissues. Just a little bit about developmental aspects. Your muscular development reflects neuromuscular coordination, so that gets into recruitment. We've talked about how your brain actually has to decide, I'm going to tell these motor neurons to stimulate their motor units so that we can have a muscle contraction. And you can imagine, when you do something like you're running or you're picking up a heavy weight off of the floor and you make all these nice smooth movements without even really thinking too deeply about it. Imagine all of the calculations your brain is having to make and how it's having to coordinate which motor neurons down in your spinal cord and so forth need to send signals to their muscle fibers and in which muscles. I mean, it's pretty amazing how all of that works. So that gets into neuromuscular coordination. Now when we're a child, this actually develops first in proximal areas and then extends to distal areas. So it develops from head to toe and proximal to distal, which makes sense when you think about some of the movements that little babies make later, things like walking and so forth, or it's really one of the last things that they learn to do. And again, that's just getting into your brain has to learn how to coordinate all of these movement activities and direct all of these muscles. By the time you're about a mid-adolescence, this is when you actually have your peak natural neural control. That's kind of sad to think about. So when you're a teenager, that's when your brain is at its best at coordinating all of these muscle movements. Now, athletics and training, as you get older, it's one of the reasons why it's important to keep exercising, because the more you use your muscles, it forces your brain to maintain this neuromuscular control. So it can adapt. Neurons in your brain can continue to learn how to direct these coordinated movements that you need. So that's one of the reasons why they tell us it's so important to stay active and moving as you get older, because if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. Some gender differences. In females, and we all know males on average have a greater skeletal muscle mass than females. In females, skeletal muscle makes up about 36% of their body mass, males about 42%. So that's not all that big of a difference. However, on average, males are heavier than females. So 42% of a heavier weight is going to be pretty substantially different from 36% of a lighter type of weight. And those gender differences mainly due to the male sex hormone testosterone. It just stimulates more muscle fiber hypertrophy than what occurs in females. Interestingly, though, if you look at body strength per unit of muscle mass, so a pound of muscle in a female versus a pound of muscle in a male, body strength is about the same in both sexes. So it really just boils down to, on average, females don't have as much muscle mass as males, and that's why, on average, they're not going to be quite as strong. All right, how about what happens with aging? So unfortunately, as we get older, muscle fibers decrease, so we're not as good at experiencing muscle fiber hypertrophy as we get older. You're going to lose muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are living cells, so they wind up dying as we get older, and they tend to get replaced with connective tissues, which are not going to help you contract your muscles. So they're just filler. Connective tissues often are filler. So connective types will often replace dead tissues that are unable to be repaired or undergo mitosis. By age 30, you begin to lose your muscle mass. Some people say it's more like 25. That's called sarcopenia. So sarco there referring to your muscle fibers, like sarcolemma, sarcoplasmic reticulum. However, if you exercise regularly, you can reverse sarcopenia. You can slow it down. It's kind of like what we studied with, what we talked about with osteoporosis. If you want to ward off osteoporosis, exercise more. That stimulates more bone tissue production. Same thing with your muscles. The more you exercise, the more you move around, the more that's going to stimulate your muscle fibers to maintain those thin and thick filaments and keep those muscle fibers working. As you get older, you may experience something called claudication, and this is fatigue, weakness, and pain. It can even be painful. Where you're using your muscles and maybe you're not even really stressing them out all that much, but they just wear out pretty quickly. You feel weak, and it can even be painful. And a lot of times that is due, not always, but a lot of times that is due to atherosclerosis. Those are blockages of the arteries, or thickening of the walls is probably a better way to think about it. Your blood vessels, the walls get thicker, you have less space for blood to flow through, so it's cutting off the blood flow to tissues. So if that's occurring, and often it occurs in more distal locations away from the trunk. So your leg muscles, like your calf muscles and so forth, might wear out pretty quickly as you get older and you're walking around. If you've got atherosclerosis, thickening of the arteries, cuts off the blood supply to those muscles, they're going to wear out pretty quickly. That's called claudication. Apparently, physicians can classify that according to blocks that you can walk. Like if you can walk one block and you start feeling weak and pain, that's called one block claudication. If you can walk 5 blocks before you start feeling worn out and experiencing pain, that's called 5 block claudication. So you might run into that term at some point. or that phrase at some point. All right. Another disorder we do hear a lot about with regard to the muscular system is muscular dystrophy, or MD. So this is there's not one type of muscular dystrophy. There are several different types. The most common type is Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is the most common type, and that occurs in boys. And the reason for that is because the gene, this is a genetic-based illness, and the gene that causes this problem is located on the X chromosome. So that's one of the sex chromosomes. Boys only have one X chromosome. Girls have two. So if you have a defective gene and you're a boy, that's your only copy of the gene if you're a boy. So if this gene is defective, you're going to wind up with muscular dystrophy. In females, they would have to inherit a copy of that gene from both their mother and their father in order to develop this type of muscular dystrophy, because they have two X chromosomes, and as long as they have one good gene, they're not going to have the disease. So it's very rare in females. There are other types of muscular dystrophy as well, though. I'm just talking about the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. The problem with this is over time, your muscle fibers atrophy. They decrease in size, they may die, they don't get replaced, and you can wind up with fat and connective tissue deposits in the muscles in their place. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is due to a defect. There's a protein that's actually called dystrophin, and it was discovered way after the disease muscular dystrophy was first described, so it was actually named for the disease. So this protein is defective in patients who have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So they have a genetic defect, and they don't make this protein. What that protein does, all right, so if we've got a muscle fiber, it's kind of interesting. Hang on. If you got a muscle fiber here, all right, so here's your sarcolemma. All right, and then you've got, in the sarcolemma, you've got lots of proteins that are sitting in there that are part of what's called the dystrophin complex of proteins. And then the dystrophin itself is this spring-like protein that extends from there down into the sarcoplasm, the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber, and it actually connects to actin filaments. So this is your dystrophin protein. It's like a spring, and you've got lots of these in your muscle fibers, not just one. And then this protein complex over here has attachments to things like collagen fibers in the extracellular matrix. So basically what's thought is in patients who have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, you lack these dystrophin proteins, and so you don't have proper connections between the actin fibers on the inside of the muscle cell, the sarcolemma, the cell membrane, and because of that, then these guys are also supposed to be connected to the collagen fibers out in the extracellular matrix. So basically these proteins are involved in keeping everything stable. And if you don't have these dystrophin proteins, they're kind of like a spring, so they help things kind of spring back in place and maintain things in their proper position. Apparently the muscle fibers tear apart really easily. They just break apart, they die, and your muscles experience atrophy, so you lose your muscle coordination, and that's when you experience these symptoms of muscle weakness that occur in patients who have that. Most muscular dystrophy patients, people who have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, only live to about age 25. And I think I talked about all of this already, yeah. 1 in 3,500 males will develop Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. like I said, death usually occurs to that when your diaphragm is a skeletal muscle. So when you lose your diaphragm function, you can't breathe, and you're going to wind up dying. That's typically what happens with these patients in their early 20s. We don't have a cure for this yet. I mean, I know I grew up watching the muscular dystrophy telethon as a kid, so it's been going on for a long, long period of time. So we still don't have a cure for this disease. Thank goodness, though, we know what gene is defective in the patients who have this illness. So hopefully in the future, at some point, we'll be able to do gene therapy, maybe with an engineered virus, to go in and replace that defective gene in the muscle fibers of patients who have this. Or people are talking about taking stem cells of some type, which haven't specialized yet, and stimulating those to replace defective muscle fibers, and these cells would have the correct dystrophin gene, so they would wind up making genes code for proteins. They would code for the dystrophin protein that's missing in these patients' muscle fibers. So hopefully those types of things will happen somewhere down the road. So it's been a devastating disease that's been studied for a long, long period of time. All right, that was just a little bit about some aging and development issues, and also a couple of disorders. And so we have finally concluded your Unit 4 physiology. Please be sure you read through the Unit 4 study guide, because I may have some additional pointers on there about things that you should research on your own, look up in the textbook or elsewhere prior to taking the Unit 4 physiology exam. And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know, or post it over on the Piazza discussion board so everybody can chime in and help you figure some things out.